Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, ganz herzlich willkommen hier bei uns im Körber-Forum. Es ist pünktlich um 7 Uhr, das heißt, wir fangen an. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie heute bei uns sind und ich freue mich ganz besonders, dass Sie so zahlreich bei uns sind heute. Wir haben ja heute starke Konkurrenz mit 2 Champions-League-Spielen mit deutscher Beteiligung. Wir drücken von hier aus die Daumen für unsere beiden Teams und wir freuen uns natürlich umso mehr, dass Sie sich heute entschieden haben, bei uns zu sein und nicht Fußball zu gucken. Wir haben heute ein sehr spannendes Thema, was, glaube ich, tagesaktueller nicht sein könnte. Wir wollen uns beschäftigen mit der Rolle der USA im Nahen und Mittleren Osten. Und es gibt den alten Spruch, den einige von Ihnen vielleicht kennen: Wenn du nicht zum Nahen Osten kommst, dann kommt der Nahe Osten zu dir. Und ich glaube, das ist genau das, was den Amerikanern im Moment passiert. Viel ist ja geungt worden über einen möglichen Rückzug der USA aus der Region, Stichwort Pivot to Asia, Schwenk nach Asien. In Washington ist man der Ansicht, dass die Musik geopolitisch, wirtschaftlich eigentlich im 21. Jahrhundert in Asien spielt und dass man deswegen Ressourcen aus dem Nahen Osten in diese Region verlagern sollte. Die amerikanische Öffentlichkeit ist kriegsmüde nach 2 kostspieligen Kriegen im Irak und in Afghanistan. Und auch Barack Obama ist eigentlich angetreten, als Friedenspräsident in die Geschichte einzugehen und nicht als Präsident, der wieder, wie es im Moment der Fall ist, mit Militärtruppen im Irak und in Syrien präsent sein muss. Die USA sind zurück in Nahost, falls von Rückzug überhaupt jemals die Rede sein konnte. Sie unterstützen, ich habe es schon kurz gesagt, gemeinsam mit einer internationalen Koalition die Kurden im Kampf gegen den Islamischen Staat mit Luftschlägen. Sie haben zugesagt, ungefähr 5000 syrische Rebellen auszustatten und auszubilden. Sie sind Teil der Nukleargespräche mit Iran, die darauf abzielen, eine Lösung des Nuklearkonflikts herbeizuführen. Sie haben versucht, Frieden zwischen Israel und Palästina zu schaffen und. Die Amerikaner sind zurück im Nahen Osten. Wir wollen heute fragen, was ist es eigentlich mit diesem Rückzug? Ist der verschoben? War der jemals geplant? Und wie sieht die Rolle der Amerikaner in der Region aus? Und wie geht es eigentlich weiter mit den USA im Nahen und Mittleren Osten? Ich freue mich sehr, dass wir zu diesem spannenden Thema heute 2 sehr spannende Gäste bei uns haben, 2 junge Stimmen aus Washington und aus der Region. Ein herzliches Willkommen an Brooke Neuman und Emile Hokayem. Lassen Sie mich unsere beiden Gäste heute kurz vorstellen. Brooke Neuman, wie gesagt, aus Washington, heute zum ersten Mal hier in Hamburg, wie ich gerade erfahren habe. Sie hat lange Zeit im amerikanischen Verteidigungsministerium gearbeitet, unter anderem im Stab des Verteidigungsministers. Sie hat sich vor allem beschäftigt mit dem Nahen Osten und Zentralasien. Sie war für verschiedene Denkfabriken in Washington tätig und ist im Moment die Büroleiterin von General Stanley McChrystal in der McChrystal Group. Einige von Ihnen werden General McChrystal vielleicht noch in Erinnerung haben als Kommandeur der ISAF-Mission in Afghanistan. Ich glaube, man kann sagen, dass Brooke ja wirklich eine Insiderin ist der Washingtoner Szene. Sie kennt den Maschinenraum der amerikanischen Außen- und Sicherheitspolitik sozusagen von innen und wir freuen uns sehr, dass sie heute bei uns ist. Herzlich willkommen nochmal, Brooke. Unser zweiter Gast heute ist Emile Hokayem. Emile ist Senior Fellow for Middle East Security am renommierten International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Emile selber ist aber basiert in der Region und zwar in Manama, Bahrain, am Persischen Golf. Aber so ganz stimmt es eigentlich nicht, denn wenn man seinem Twitter-Account Glauben schenken darf, da steht bei der Ortsangabe I'm somewhere on a plane above you. Also ich bin irgendwo in einem Flugzeug über euren Köpfen und das zeigt Ihnen, wie viel Emile in der Region unterwegs ist. Wir freuen uns, dass er heute hier ist. Er arbeitet vor allem zu den Staaten der Levante, also insbesondere Syrien und Libanon. Er hat ein Buch geschrieben zum Aufstand, zum Bürgerkrieg in Syrien, ein exzellentes Buch, was inzwischen ja zu einem Standardwerk zu dem Konflikt geworden ist. Er beschäftigt sich intensiv auch mit den arabischen Golfstaaten und natürlich auch mit amerikanischer Nahostpolitik in der Region. Und, das darf ich nicht und will ich nicht vergessen, er ist Munich Young Leader. Das ist ein gemeinsames Projekt, das wir, die Körber-Stiftung, zusammen mit der Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz machen zur Förderung und Stärkung des sicherheitspolitischen Nachwuchses. Auch dir, Emile, nochmal ein ganz, ganz herzliches Willkommen in Hamburg. Ja, meine Damen und Herren, das war es jetzt erstmal von meiner Seite für den Auftakt. Wir wollen beginnen jetzt mit unserer Diskussion. Diejenigen unter Ihnen, die der Diskussion auf Deutsch folgen möchten, Sie haben wahrscheinlich schon Ihren Knopf im Ohr. Mir sagte man vorhin, dass Kanal 1 für Deutsch ist und Kanal 2 für Englisch. So, in diesem Sinne möchte ich unsere beiden Gäste nun auf die Bühne bitten. And now we'll switch to English. So, Brooke, let me start with you. There is this story that President Obama was on a plane, I think, on his way somewhere in Asia, and he had some journalists with him, and one of the journalists would ask, "What is actually the core doctrine of your foreign policy, Mr. President?" And Obama answered, "My doctrine is don't do stupid stuff." So, no, don't do stupid shit, he even said. So, I think what he meant is that one shouldn't repeat the mistakes that were made by the Bush administration, in the sense that one shouldn't rush into military operations that you don't really know how to get out of. So I wanted to ask you, Brooke, could you maybe help us understand what this don't do stupid shit policy means for U.S. engagement in the Middle East?
I can't necessarily defend the idea that don't do stupid shit is a doctrine. Anybody who follows foreign policy knows that doesn't exist. In reality, I think what happened is that when President Obama was campaigning, he very much had an idealistic point of view of how foreign policy was going to be run. He regularly called Iraq the bad war, Afghanistan was the good war, and vowed to end U.S. operations in Iraq within his first term, which he did, within his first year in office, in fact. But then, once he was in office, he was confronted with the reality that don't do stupid shit wasn't going to get you far enough. Foreign policy is really based on balancing cold, hard reality and realpolitik with idealism and values. And I think he's struggled a lot finding how those two competing viewpoints actually translates into policy. And you've seen a lot of that in some of the statements that he's made. A lot of what he said at Cairo, and then not following up on certain promises and staying engaged in certain places. And only now in his second term, as far as coalition building, is he's starting to really articulate what he means by foreign policy for the Obama doctrine per se, but he still has a ways to go.
You touched upon the issue of values versus interests, and we'll certainly come to that later on. But Emile, I wanted to ask you, we had a look from Washington sort of to the region, and I wanted to ask you about the other perspective from the region on the U.S. So I think it's not a surprise that the Middle East usually makes it to top ranks when it comes to anti-Americanism. I found this recent study or analysis that was done by Princeton University, where they had a look at Arabic reactions on Twitter to major events that took place in 2012 and 2013, such as the ouster of President Morsi or a possible U.S. intervention in Syria. And the outcome of this study was that in all the cases where the U.S. is influencing Middle Eastern affairs, there was a 95 to 99% negative reaction from the people tweeting. So, as I mentioned before, you travel widely in the region. Is that the kind of sentiment you also get, or is the picture less black and white?
It's less black and white. The American role there is a tendency to magnify the American role among Arab audiences, Middle Eastern audiences. First, criticizing the US is an easy thing to do, and you're not going to be thrown in jail for doing that. It's much more difficult to criticize your own governments for their own responsibilities. It's much more difficult to criticize other actors. The US, it's fair game. I can criticize the US and publish a op-ed in the New York Times, and it will be fine. It's much more difficult for Arabs to express themselves in a more genuine way. It doesn't mean that the US role in the region is not controversial. It's extremely controversial. That's partly because of the reach of the US role and US policy in the region. I mean, it has invaded countries, it has occupied others, it's alienated a number of societies. At the same time, there is a lot of ambivalence. I mean, even as Arabs criticize the US, they demand attention, they demand engagement. And this tension is really at the heart of the contradictions in the Arab world right now. So do we criticize the US for being too engaged in Syria or not enough? My personal criticism is that the US should have taken Syria much more seriously 3-4 years ago. Today, however, the criticism is that the US is actually, bombing ISIS in Syria. So it's very difficult to strike the right balance, and especially in terms of, Arab publics. There's a tendency as well to look at the US as the Machiavellian actor. And in reality, those of us who have had experience in Washington and other places actually think that the US is naive, idealistic, and often incompetent in its policy. Not necessarily Machiavellian and manipulative in every way. But this is not how, I would say, Arab audiences, Arab publics look at the US role in the region.
So it's a bit damn if you do and damn if you don't from an American position.
Oh, we have a way of pushing ourselves on top of the agenda. I'm from the region, and like no one else. We want the attention. It may be exaggerated, and there is a very good argument in Washington and other Western capitals that the Middle East requires too much time, too much attention, too many resources that may be spent elsewhere. But at the same time, geographical proximity, societal exchanges, there is a lot out there that makes the Middle East a top issue. And President Obama tried to turn away from the region, and it came back and it bit him hard.
Let's try to understand what's behind US policy in the Middle East a bit more profoundly. Obama said at the UN General Assembly last year in 2013 that there are 3 core interests when it comes to US policy in the Middle East, and the first one was the free flow of energy from the region, the second one was destruction of terrorist networks, and third one, non-proliferations of WMD, of weapons of mass destruction. Now, these are all very strong and very important interests, obviously, and if we look at the current situation in the region, it seems to me it's quite clear that it will take quite some time to defend and to pursue those interests. So, Brooke, do you think, wasn't the idea flawed from the beginning to think that the US could ever reduce its engagement in the Middle East?
I think a lot of this is actually based more on a poor articulation of what US policy is. In Washington, D.C., in the think tanks, the administration, everyone talked about the, quote, pivot to Asia. And I think that was a really poor choice of words. A pivot implies literally that you're turning your back on something else. So we were turning our backs on the Middle East. In reality, the US never stopped being engaged in the Middle East. We ramped down some of our presence there, namely in Iraq and some of the supporting areas around it. So the US military footprint might have decreased, but our engagement diplomatically, et cetera, increased. One of the tenets of US foreign policy that you listed had to do with the free flow of oil and gas. That also applies to Asia as well. I think what the Obama administration was trying to say, and unfortunately did very poorly and had backlash with some of our partners in the Middle East, was say that the United States has a lot of interests and they're global. We have interest in ensuring that waterways stay open in Asia, that democracy is allowed to flourish among our partners there, protecting our partners in Asia as well. That wasn't meant to be at the expense of our partners at the Middle East, but most people got the impression that that's what the United States was going to do. It was really more poor rhetoric than anything else.
So we talked about interests. Let's talk about values for a second, and that's a question for you, Emile. You already mentioned Obama's speech in Cairo, where he tried to do this reset in relations between the U.S. and the Islamic world. And he said that he and the U.S. is staying committed to governments, he said, that reflect the will of the people. And what he meant, of course, is democracy, although he didn't use the word because the word is not so, or it's at least fraught in the region. So in that Anga speech of 2013, he didn't mention democracy anymore, or at least he didn't give it the prominent position that he used to. So I wonder, has the pendulum of US policy in the region swung back from a very idealistic policy towards realpolitik, or how do you see that?
I don't think that President Obama was ever an idealistic president. To the contrary, I think he was very cynical, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but he was much more focused on US domestic priorities, on global relations with key powers, etc. And he saw the Middle East as basically a drug. The Cairo speech was a beautiful exercise in rhetorical prowess, President Obama excels in that. But in reality, there was very little meat to that speech. He felt that he needed to do this to clear some of the water after very bruising years under the Bush administration. In a way, he succeeded. The speech in of itself is a good one. But U.S. policy on democracy promotion actually decreased and became a less relevant aspect of U.S. policy in the Middle East in general. I think the speech at the General Assembly was a much more telling speech, a much more accurate one. He defined U.S. interests in a much narrower way. We can disagree with that. But he defined them in much clearer, more narrower way. And another point here is that, we talk about U.S. withdrawal from the region. I prefer the word retrenchment than withdrawal. The U.S., as Brooke just mentioned, hasn't fundamentally changed its defense posture in the region. It maintains the basis. It's still the dominant military power. Actually, the U.S. is such a dominant military power in the region that it's not an external power. The U.S. is a Middle Eastern country, like others. It has the most powerful military around. It has a massive investment. But at the rhetorical level, the pivot to Asia, or the concept of a pivot to Asia, has really created some confusion among Arab leaders, but also Arab societies about the priority given to this region in Washington. But it did something else as well. It also exposed a lot of the contradictions, a lot of the rifts in the Middle East that weren't that clear before. I mean, try to remember when President Obama came to power, the fundamental rift in the region was, whether you agree with it or not, was countries allied with Iran against countries opposed to Iran. I mean, these were the two axes. Today, I mean, I lose sight of the number of axes and divisions in the region. And actually, the US retrenchment was not the cause for that, but exposed all the divisions inside the Arab world and inside the Middle East. And now we have to live with all these new competitions, all these new rivalries among Middle Eastern actors, state and non-state actors for that matter. So, this whole notion of democracy promotion, I think, has sailed by at this point. I don't see any real US commitment behind it. Perhaps the past 3 years have shown that it's going to take a very, very long time, so perhaps being cautious and cynical is a good way for the US to approach the region, at least on the issue of political reform.
Both you, Brooke, and you, Emile, said that actually the US is still very strongly engaged in the region and it is there to stay. But I wonder, looking at the region as it is today, and it's in quite a chaotic state, I would say, how much influence does the US actually have in that region with all its military might and all its economic and political power? But there are people who say that the US influence is decreasing, is waning. How do you see that? Emile, maybe you can start on that.
It has certainly decreased in recent years. It's not just the doing of President Obama or President Bush. I mean, there are other structural factors. We all talk about the rise of Asia. Well, even the Arab and other Middle Eastern states notice the rise of Asia, so they have an interest in developing relations with Asia. And relations with Asia are simpler from their perspective because there is no political conditionality, no human rights conditions, there are no environmental ones. When you deal with China or Indonesia, etc. When you deal with the United States, when it's your main partner, Congress may talk about human rights in Egypt, and you will have issues if you're the UAE and you're trying to buy a company in the US. So the relationship is much more complicated with the US. So the Middle Eastern actors themselves have invited or are interested in diversifying their relations. So by definition, this has diluted US influence. At the same time, whenever there is a real political or security crisis, everyone wants to call the White House. They don't call the Kremlin, they don't call Beijing or other rising actors. That puts a huge burden on American shoulders, but it's also more perverse than that. The reason why Washington needs to continue caring about the Middle East is largely because its Asian allies or partners want Washington to care about the Middle East. No one is ready to come in and play a role in the crisis in the region because it's very costly in terms of image, in terms of attention, etc. The US, in a way, is stuck because not only Middle Eastern actors want its attention, but also its partners elsewhere want the US to remain engaged. They're free riders in a way. China, Japan, anyone who imports energy from the Middle East benefits from the US spending billions of dollars, perhaps $100 billion a year, securing the sea lanes to Asia.
Brooke, I think that's a very interesting point. I'd be interested in your take. How do you see the burden sharing with the Europeans when it comes to this, messy region which produces so many problems for all of us? Are you satisfied with the contribution that we Europeans are making? And Emile is smiling.
I don't think it's an issue of being satisfied with what Europe has or can provide. Emile hit it correctly that the United States is required to act in the Middle East at this point. Everyone calls for the White House. People are upset when the United States gets too involved, isn't involved enough. The reality is, though, right now, even though their influence has waned, the United States is the only country right now who has the level of influence, both militarily and diplomatically, to be able to play the role that they're currently playing. Of course, the United States would like to see Europe play a larger role. You'll see that as the coalition for Operation Inherent Resolve is being built. The United States is already calling for NATO allies to provide trainers on the ground in Iraq. And there's going to be issues when it comes to coalition building. There were issues when it came to Iraq and Afghanistan. It's difficult to build a coalition from the communications level to the tactical level up to the strategic level as far as what missions are once you're on the ground. The better able the United States is to align those, the easier it is to have a more influential coalition. And I think that's where the United States is going to be looking right now to Europe, is to come up with some common goals and then to resource them from there.
Mm-hmm. So it's still the U.S. is still the indispensable nation in the region.
Yes, whether or not we like to be.
Yeah. You mentioned the anti-ISIL coalition briefly. I wanted to dwell on that point for a moment. There is this saying that if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, and it seems that in Syria and Iraq, the US uses its biggest hammer at the moment, namely military force. Now, I think most people would agree that a problem like ISIL cannot be tackled by military force alone, and what it needs is building a new political and social order in Iraq and Syria, and of course this is a big word to say, but I wonder, what can the US do beyond military engagement to work to that new order?
So the way that I like to look at the Operation Inherent Resolve, which is right now limited to airstrikes and limited amounts of advisors on the ground in Iraq, is that this is a very small thing the United States could be doing as far as military force is concerned. So as far as if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, I actually think it's a sign of US restraint that thus far that's all we've committed. The reality on the ground is that there's no partner to work with. So as far as political and diplomatic efforts are concerned, there's not a real moderate group in Syria that the United States can work with. So if you look at it more as a chess game, you're looking 3-4 chess moves down the road. So there's airstrikes, and we're able to contain the influence that ISIL has up until this point. Then eventually we need to have people on the ground to rebuild the institutions in Syria. There's total societal disarray, and that's going to take a long time. And unfortunately, I don't see any scenario where, and I hate to say the word, but nation building isn't required. This comes back to US and its partners and what we're willing and capable of doing. I don't see a scenario right now where we don't get to that really difficult decision if beyond putting boots on the ground, we're putting nation builders on the ground, and we're rebuilding Syrian society, and what is that supposed to look like, and who's in charge of coming up with that, and who do we partner with right now? I know I went a little bit further than your question asked, but in broader context, we're dealing with a really difficult problem that doesn't have a right solution right now. So I'd actually say it's a good thing that the United States hasn't gone full-fledged into Syria, into Iraq, because we don't really know what we want the outcome to be right now.
Emile, I have a sense that you may want to disagree on that one.
I not necessarily disagree, but look, Syria for me is the example of U.S. policy-making failure, massive one. We've known for 3.5 years that Syria was fragmenting. We've known for a few years that this would benefit the most radical forces. And the United States in particular, but not only the US, also a number of European countries and others, have deluded, I would say, themselves into thinking that this was a containable problem. There was a deliberate decision not to take the conflict seriously early on, to actually look at some of the root causes, and develop partners inside the Syrian opposition and rebellion, which means that today, President Obama is compelled to intervene on 2 battlefields at the same time, Iraq and Syria, in circumstances not of his choosing, in a timing not of his choosing. Well, he could have done something at a much lower level in the past 2-3 years, working with the Syrian rebellion, which, by the way, is the one that fought ISIS the first and actually dealt a very serious setback to ISIS in the past year until they were outgunned more recently. But it goes to the heart of the Obama approach to the region. Retrenchment until there is a crisis that forces his administration, his government, to step up its involvement in much more complex circumstances and in ways that won't necessarily deliver something satisfactory. I would argue that today the campaign against ISIS is not going well. The strategy is not in sync with the needs, with the complexities of the battlefield. An air campaign in Iraq and a very limited approach in Syria are not going to do it. ISIS is going to grow, but the question is, how do you weaken ISIS? And this is fundamentally a political issue, as you were trying to refer to. ISIS benefits from the support of disenfranchised Sunni communities all over Syria. Sunni communities that have been pummeled by the Assad regime for the past 3.5 years. We've kept silent about this. Yes, there is some outrage, but not much has been done. Those communities are turning to a protector, any protector against Assad, and they've embraced ISIS. Not because they necessarily ideologically agree with ISIS, and I would argue that many of those communities do not. But we let them essentially alone in the struggle. And today, there's even talk of working with Assad or Iran against ISIS. This will only drive up the support of these communities for ISIS. They won't forget that. And this is the fundamental contradiction in US policy, is that today, what threats are you trying to contain in the region? Is it Iran? Is it ISIS? Which one is the more strategic in nature? Which one is the more potent one in the short term, in the long term? There is a real lack of clarity at this level. And I'm not sure that the US administration is doing a good job at explaining its vision.
You mentioned Iran, and I think it is fair to say that a rapprochement with Tehran has been one of the big foreign policy projects of the two Obama administrations, actually. We all remember this phone call last year between Obama and his Iranian colleague Rouhani, which was the first phone call of that type since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And now the U.S. is at the table in the E3+3 talks to reach a final agreement with Iran over the nuclear conflict. So I wonder, Brooke, do you think that the Obama administration got its priorities right when it comes to the region, when it comes to Iran as such an important issue in its policy vis-a-vis the region? And how optimistic are you that this détente between Washington and Tehran is going to continue? Things don't look that encouraging when it comes to the nuclear talks.
So I certainly don't speak for the U.S. government or the Obama administration. And I'm going to disagree with them strongly. I think the United States has their priorities right in that Iran is a longer-term threat to U.S. interests in the region and globally than ISIS is. The reality is, in 5-10 years, it's unclear whether or not the Islamic State will exist in its current form. But Iran is, and the United States is. And I think that where the United States has lost its priorities is when dealing with Iran as far as the enrichment negotiations are going. I think the United States has somewhat lost its way and lost a lot of its leverage. In the last year with the sanctions relief, the only thing that it's delivered for the US is Iran out of economic collapse. And it hasn't actually reached any of the goals that the US would like, which is to roll back Iran's ability to have a breakout capability as far as building a weapon, weaponizing uranium. And I personally think that the United States in the upcoming, this is why I'm a little bit negative about the ongoing negotiations. The United States should be using a stronger line against Iran, making sure that they entirely separate it from the issues related to the Islamic State and taking the longer point of view of what U.S. interests are in the region instead of trying to conflate it with the short-term win and warming of relations with Tehran.
Mm-hmm. Emile, your take on that one?
I think a nuclear deal with Iran is much needed at this stage. I mean, I understand the Obama administration's focus on this because, you know, it's an opportunity. There are not that many opportunities in the region, so if you can, you know, try that one, and why not? I think actually the U.S. administration has done a good job on this front in terms of the negotiations. It has done a less good job essentially at reassuring and at consulting with its allies and explaining how it is separating the nuclear negotiations track from regional security issues. And this is where a lot of the tension in the region comes from. This notion that the United States, as it tries to reduce its role in the region, will increasingly work with Iran, or or is even hoping for a strategic realignment away from traditional Sunni partners towards a rapprochement, perhaps a strategic partnership with Iran down the road. We're far away from this. For the moment, I think that a deal by November 24 is unlikely. I wish we could have a strong deal, and a strong deal, I define a strong deal by the strengths and the merits of its terms, not by the hope we place in Iran helping on other battlefields in the region. And this is a very key point here. Because we see the Sunni world collapsing or very weakened in the region, we have this tendency of thinking that Iran will be a helpful partner in all these other places. So we have to talk to Iran on Iraq or on Syria or on Lebanon. So Iran becomes a central player everywhere. Even though it cannot deliver much, Iran's capacity to create trouble or to promote its allies doesn't necessarily mean a capacity to stabilize those countries and build nations, modern, well-integrated nations. We shouldn't place too much hope in Iran in the short to medium term when it comes to regional security issues. But the nuclear deal, much needed. It's an issue of global security. It would be a terrible precedent if those negotiations were to fall and Iran would press ahead with its nuclear program.
You said don't put too much hope in Iran as a constructive force in the region. At the same time, it seems to me that it would be very good to have some sort of dialogue and rapprochement between Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia, the other big hit on the block in the region, on the other hand. So I wonder, do you see any role for the US in that and trying to bring these two big players in the region closer together?
Look, I'm certainly not arguing against engaging Iran or talking to Iran on all these issues. Perhaps the US doesn't have to do it immediately, but certainly other regional actors should. Iran is part of the region. It will be here 500 years from now. It's a massive country with amazing talent. It's a great civilization. It will benefit enormously the Middle East if Iran becomes a normal country, one that doesn't necessarily seek to propagate revolutionary ideas, etc. But we're not there yet. I mean, we tend to see on television either or engage either the more hardline factions in Iran, or when we go to Iran or when we welcome them, we talk to the nicest people in the Iranian system. The reality is that we don't know who's calling the shots, and in reality, most of the time, those who call the shots are at the more radical end of the spectrum there. We saw this on Syria, for instance. Iran is full in Syria. Full in. Like just a couple of days ago, a very senior Iranian general was killed in Aleppo. The difference between Iran and Saudi Arabia is that Iran sends personnel on the ground. Saudi Arabia may support Syrian factions. Iran is fully invested. So Iran is difficult to ignore. But we shouldn't place too much hope, especially in the context of the nuclear negotiations. Let's get to a deal, and let's agree on the deal because it's a good deal, not because we hope that something else may happen afterwards. So I'm very skeptical about the current environment and how far it will go.
But again, on the issue of Iran talking to Saudi Arabia, is there a role for an external mediator, be it the US or another power?
There's certainly a role because the US has to make sure that Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region, allied countries, don't panic about this engagement. The US will have to play this role, but I don't think that the US has to be in the room when the Saudis and the Iranians talk. This should be a bilateral discussion. Each of them should consult with their other allies. But the US is not going to be the prime driver, the prime mediator between those two countries. It will benefit. If there is a detente between those two countries, the US will benefit. If there is a deterioration in relations between those two countries, the US will actually suffer. But I don't see a direct role in those kind of discussions.
I wanted to shift our focus for a moment to another important actor, which isn't necessarily Middle Eastern, but which still has an influence in the Middle East, and that is Turkey. There is a very hot debate at the moment about Turkey's role or non-role, some people would say, in the fight against ISIL, and some people would say that Turkey just didn't get its priorities right, whether it should fight ISIL or the PYD or work towards the fall of the Assad regime. Now, Brooke, from your sense in Washington, what do you think? What's the state of play in the relations between Turkey and the U.S. at the moment?
I think even though the United States and Turkey are having discussions right now about what role Turkey should play and what role the United States should have in Turkey as far as being able to have access to Incirlik, setting up a no-fly zone, a buffer zone, etc. Turkey's in a really tough position. And I think the United States is empathetic to that because they're in the same position the United States is in. They're being asked to do things and partner with people who, in their mind, pose an existential threat to Turkey. They don't want to work with the PYD, and they definitely don't want to be seen in any way, shape, or form supporting the PKK. And that's what a lot of people are asking them to do right now, and Turkey won't do it. You've seen in the past few days even, there's been somewhat of a softening. They're allowing the Peshmerga to use Turkish territory to get into Kobani, et cetera. Right now, it almost feels like Turkey is asking for a quid pro quo from the United States. Set up a no-fly zone, will allow lines of communication through Incirlik, et cetera. A no-fly zone is a huge commitment to ask for. That would cost roughly $1 billion a month for the United States to maintain. That is a huge number, and it's a long commitment. It requires a lot of shifting of resources, and it's unclear to what end a no-fly zone would actually support any strategic role or strategic aims the United States has in the region. I don't think that Turkey and the United States are at an impasse right now. I think this goes back to the original question of what we were going to ask our partners and allies to do as far as our role in the Middle East. The problem is that we haven't properly articulated what we're trying to achieve, so we can't exactly push Turkey to go in one way or another towards a sort of murky goal. And that's causing a lot of, I think tension is even too strong of a word, but a lot of the sort of rift in how the U.S. and Turkey sees this going forward.
I mean, what we're seeing at the moment is pretty much the erosion of the post-Ottoman order in the Middle East, what some people call Sykes-Picot. And if there is one winner of that situation, then it's probably the Kurds. So what's the thinking in Washington about, the national aspirations of the Kurds? I mean, can Washington live with a Kurdish state in some distant future?
I think the issue more with the Kurdish state is whether or not our allies can live with the existence of a Kurdish state. And Turkey is a NATO ally. We're not going to support something that threatens their territorial integrity. It creates a real problem for the future of a unified Iraq. And in Syria, I mean, it's so chaotic in Syria right now. I'm not really sure how that would impact what's happening on the ground right now. So I don't think there's really right now a Kurdish state to support or not, because the way that it fits into the region right now is be so messy.
Emile, do you see any, long-term strategic thinking in Washington when it comes to sort of the reshaping of the Levant? I mean, it seems to me that something historic is going on in that region, and what can be done about that?
I think after the delusion of the Bush years about social and political re-engineering of the Arab world, cooler heads prevail in Washington all across the spectrum, or among and in the foreign policy establishment. It's not about reshaping the region; it's about managing its many crises and do it in a way that is cost-effective, makes strategic sense, etc. the fragmentation of the Levant is a process that's going to last years and decades. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult for the residents, the inhabitants of the Levant, and it's going to be very difficult for the whole neighborhood to handle. We're talking about, in the case of Syria, just half of the population are either refugees or internally displaced people. It's the biggest humanitarian crisis today. It's just a magnitude that we can't even fathom. Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey are directly hit. So it's really about managing those consequences. The problem is that I think that President Obama has gone too far too quickly, and so the strategic thinking in Washington today is among all these advisors around candidates for the 2016 election. These are the people who are going to have to live with the results of U.S. policy, but U.S. policy alone should not be blamed for the problems of the region. But these are the people who will inherit either a nuclear deal or no nuclear deal with Iran, with further fragmentation in Syria and Iraq or less fragmentation, etc. And today, among this crowd, there is no sense that there is an opportunity in the Levant. I think that there's more sense that, the Gulf states are more stable, let's continue engaging them. There was violent political change in Egypt, but let's agree that Sisi is here to stay, so let's not rock that boat. I don't see broad thinking and necessarily articulate coherent thinking. But I can't necessarily blame the foreign policy establishment for that, because none of us is able to come up with something more solid. There was a moment of opportunity. It was lost. It's behind us. Today, it's really about managing the consequences of this fragmentation and the various rifts that I discussed earlier. It's not just Iran versus Saudi Arabia. It's Saudi Arabia versus Qatar. It's political Islam versus conservative Sunni monarchies. It's a very, very different Middle East that we're dealing with than the one we saw just 5-6 years ago.
Brooke, Emile just talked about missed opportunities. When we think back 3 years ago, 3 or almost 4 years ago, when the Arab Spring broke out, did you think that this was a missed opportunity for the U.S.? Should it have reacted differently to this historic development in the region?
I wish people would stop calling it the Arab Spring. At the time, of course, it was a very hopeful time, and everyone thought that we were going to see sort of a resurgence of more liberal societies and self-determination. And unfortunately, that's not where things ended up. 4 years later, I think we can agree that that's not exactly what happened. Hindsight is always 20/20. And I think we can look back 4 years and say the United States was wholly unprepared for the Arab Spring. Missed opportunities, missteps all along the way. I think starting with the United States, and I think we're still seeing aftermath of this today, turning our backs on Mubarak. I'm not saying that we should have supported Mubarak or that he was the right person for Egypt, but that really started sort of the domino effect of U.S. losing a lot of leverage in the region. A staunch ally, a partner of the United States, Mubarak, we basically said, you know what, we support the people, you should step down, and it started to create an effect where other leaders in the region were really questioning the U.S. commitment to them. It definitely made King Abdullah think about where he stood with the United States. It made Jordan think about where he stood with the United States. And we've seen a lot of sort of the negative impact of that since then. The United States, I'm not exactly sure what the exact role they should have played in the Arab Spring. Perhaps they should have been more quiet. Perhaps they should have been more engaged from the very beginning. But we took sort of a middling road, and that hasn't really gotten us much as far as either having leverage or having much of an impact on some of the fractures that we're seeing today.
But I mean, value-wise, wouldn't it have been very difficult to have this democracy movement in Egypt and work towards keeping the longtime dictator in place?
that's I mean, you hit the nail on the head with that one. That's where the real struggle comes in between realpolitik and idealism. Of course, the United States would like to say, hands down, anybody who wants democracy, we're going to support you. But that also means, in the case of Egypt, that the Muslim Brotherhood came back to power, who also is not part of U.S. interests. I think it's important to remember the old axiom when it comes to the Middle East, that the enemy of my enemy is still sometimes my enemy. So there's not always a good solution for the United States to be siding with somebody. We're very, I mean, Emile said it before, sort of our democracy building efforts have waned in the last 6 years. Sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of the reality is that everything that we're trying to accomplish in the Middle East is underpinned in stability. And sometimes stability and more liberal societies don't go hand in hand, and there's no good, both idealistic and realistic role that the United States can play.
That's very realpolitik.
Yes.
Emile, your view from the region.
I totally disagree. First, I agree. Let's start with the one area of agreement. I don't like the word Arab Spring either, but for very different reasons. First, I think it places undue expectations on the shoulders of Arabs compared to others. I mean, we got used to peaceful political change, especially here in Europe, in the 90s. Political change happens in very messy, very violent ways in most places. What happened in '89 here was a historical aberration. The second point is that I call it Arab awakening because I want to convey a sense that it's going to take a long time, that it's really about people becoming politically, socially conscious. It's going to be very messy. Every revolution, every of the great revolution, including the American one, were very flawed revolutions. I mean, it took the US, 150 years to give voting rights and so on. It's just, the process is, and we shouldn't be judged on a totally different scale. I mean, now there's this notion that, the Arab world is this place of massive violence and people are dying and it's only 70 years ago that, Westerners killed each other in the tens of millions. In actually relative terms, historical terms, levels of violence in the Middle East are much lower than they were in Europe back then. It doesn't mean that it cannot get worse, and it doesn't mean that what's happening is acceptable or justifiable. I'm just trying to say that political change, by definition, is messy. Now, the second point, on Mubarak, which was brought, the US couldn't have done anything. It didn't bring down Mubarak, and it couldn't have shored up Mubarak. In any case, the US doesn't provide regime security guarantees to its allies. It's here to, it has defense agreements, it offers security guarantees against external threats or against transnational threats. But it doesn't guarantee the survival of the regimes in the region. It should not do that either. So yes, a number of Arab states were taken aback. Oh, the US has abandoned Mubarak. But this is not what the US has committed to do. And it shouldn't do that. The third point, the fourth point on this issue is that the Arab world is not a monolithic place. It's very diverse. Change is happening very differently depending on the country. The grievances and the demands we saw in 2011 were shared all across the region. But the way they unfolded are fundamentally shaped by local conditions, the societal makeup of societies, the strengths of the military, etc. There are elections in Tunisia in a couple of days. Tunisia is the success story. We shouldn't hype it too much, but it's actually a good one. Libya missed the boat, largely because of Libyans themselves. They were offered an opportunity, I think, and they missed it. We were very cynical towards the Syrians. We actually provided very little help, very little attention to this crisis. But each of these conflicts unfolded fundamentally differently because of the fabric of those societies and those political structures. And it's not in US hands to shape the outcome. The US is going to be an important player on the sidelines, but it's not going to be the fundamental one.
You said it's not in the U.S. hands to shape the conflicts or the way the conflicts in the region unfold. And before I open the floor to your questions and comments, there is one regional issue I have to address because it's the mother of all foreign policy issues for U.S. engagement in the region, and that is, of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We all know that Secretary Kerry really did his best to revive the peace process to no avail. On the contrary, we witnessed this massive escalation of violence in summer between Israel and the Hamas. Now, after this failure, Brooke, do you see Washington come back to the Israeli-Palestinian arena anytime soon?
Washington always comes back to Israel and Palestine.
Today.
Yes, every president has come back to Israel and Palestine and made it a priority of their administration to broker some sort of peace or agreement, generally towards a two-state solution. I think the United States has learned a lot in the last 3-4 years, though. Prior to the Arab awakening, we always felt that the Arab-Israel conflict, the peace process, was the end-all be-all in the Middle East. If we fixed that, the United States would fix a lot of its problems in the Middle East. And the reality is, all of the fractures that we're seeing now between Sunni Shia, Islamist, non-Islamist, civil wars, have absolutely nothing to do with the peace process at all. And perhaps our focus has been in the wrong place. The United States foreign policy arena has been so hyper-focused on Israel and Palestine that they actually haven't even invested the right amount of expertise in other parts. And that's one of the reasons why I feel like the United States was unprepared for a lot of the other things that are happening there right now. All of our main experts and efforts were put into this one small part, and we thought that this was going to be a panacea. And it turns out that we were wrong about that. I still think it's in the U.S. interests and the regional interest for there to be a peace, and one that protects Israel and their existential threat of whether or not they're going to exist, and gives the Palestinian people self-determination, a country, the ability to run that country. I don't know the right solution right now, but I don't think that the United States is going to lose interest in it anytime soon. I do think that you're going to see the U.S. start evening out their efforts as far as the Middle East is concerned.
I think the U.S. has a special responsibility when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I agree that it takes disproportionate time and attention in Washington. But I understand why this is the case, and I think we should have very high expectations of the U.S. in this arena. I don't think the U.S. can afford to turn its back on this issue, and it's held responsible, and rightly so, for the outcome of this track. The U.S. has put much less pressure on Israel than it should have over the years. I think the U.S. has been way too indulgent on this issue. And I agree. I mean, it's not... If you solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you're not going to solve the rest of the problems in the region. Certainly not. I mean, our problems are locally made. They're not all because of colonial powers in Israel, etc. But you solve the Palestinian issue principally because they deserve a state. It's a people that's been, under occupation for, almost 70 years now. It's total social dislocation, but it's also a special Western responsibility. This is a Western responsibility, and I cannot stress it enough. In terms of funding for refugees, to help to it, and turning back away because, there are other problems in the region, I think is an easy way out. And American administrations tend to invest enormously in that and then disengage enormously from it. It's just the wrong approach. Now, we should praise Secretary Kerry's effort and President Obama's effort. It hasn't worked this time. Doesn't mean they shouldn't try again. But my Palestinian friends would be appalled to hear that somehow we should relegate this issue just because there are other conflicts in the region or because of Iran, etc. No.
Ja, meine Damen und Herren, ich glaube, unsere beiden Diskutanten haben es geschafft, alle wichtigen Konflikte der Region in 50 Minuten nicht zu lösen, aber immerhin zu diskutieren. Viele Antworten, aber sicherlich auch jede Menge Fragen auf Ihrer Seite. Insofern freuen wir uns jetzt auf Ihre Fragen, auf Ihre Kommentare. Wir haben noch fast eine halbe Stunde Zeit dafür. Ich würde Sie bitten, sich kurz vorzustellen, bevor Sie eine Frage stellen oder einen Kommentar abgeben. Und bitte beschränken Sie sich, weil es bestimmt jede Menge Fragen gibt, auf eine Frage. So, wer möchte zuerst? Der Herr hier vorne in der ersten Reihe, bitte.
Ich würde gerne fragen nach der Situation Israel-Palästinenser. Sie sagten gerade, das ist 70 Jahre her. Stellen Sie sich einmal Deutschland vor 70 Jahren. Wir haben einen großen Teil des deutschen Landes verloren durch den Krieg. Das ist jetzt Polen. Dann haben wir Ostpreußen verloren. Das ist jetzt Russland. Stellen Sie sich vor, wir wären dann noch in Lagern und würden immer wieder Partisanenkämpfe gegen die Polen, gegen die Russen und gegen alles machen. Ich stelle mir vor, wenn die Palästinenser einer der vielen Gelegenheiten zugestimmt hätten, dann wäre das Problem schon lange gelöst. Und mir tun die Palästinenser leid, weil sie unter der Diktatur der Hamas oder dieser verschiedenen Terrororganisationen sind. Jetzt wurde das alles wieder zerbombt. Und warum? Weil die Hamas nicht aufhören kann, immer wieder zu provozieren, Raketen zu schicken, Anschläge zu machen. Sonst könnte man das wahrscheinlich lösen. Danke.
Emile, eine Frage für dich, beziehungsweise ein Kommentar, deine Reaktion.
Sure. The Palestinian problem precedes Hamas, and Hamas may disappear or maybe bypassed by a more extremist movement later on. We should look at this issue and we should solve it for its own merits. Look at the rights, the needs, the interests of the Palestinian people, and look at it through this frame. Not just this frame, of course, there's also the question of the security and the recognition of Israel in the region. But the problem with Israel is that it is the most powerful military actor in the region, and at the same time, psychologically, it feels very vulnerable. It feels that everyone is against it. So it's a very delicate balance to reach here. But for the Palestinians themselves, they're in Lebanon, they're in Jordan, they're in the Gulf, my friend Samar, a bunch of other places. They don't have rights. It's difficult for them to travel. It's very difficult for them to secure, their basic needs, their basic rights, etc. They will only find a stability in a state of their own. You can only weaken Hamas by creating a Palestinian state where Palestinians take responsibility for their own behavior. Today, Palestinians are not responsible for everything they actually do, and sorry to frame it this way, it's a country under occupation. It corrupts everything. It corrupts the occupier, and it corrupts the occupied society. This is where we are today. Ultimately, only a Palestinian state, alongside an Israeli state, can solve this issue. Nothing else. People talk about a Jordanian option, a trusteeship, a million ideas have been offered. Only a state that enjoys its full rights will be able to meet the aspirations of the Palestinians and lead to a moderate Palestinian society.
Die Dame hier auf der rechten Seite, vielleicht stellen Sie sich ganz kurz vor.
Das ist mein Name. Ich fand das, was auf der Bühne gesagt wurde, insgesamt zutreffend und ist auch meine Meinung. Aber ich habe in Bezug auf Assad eine andere Meinung. Ich finde, die Stigmatisierung von ihm ist kontraproduktiv, denn er er war sicherlich ein Tyrann, aber man hat es ja bei dem sogenannten arabischen Frühling gesehen, dass er das kleinere Übel war. Er hatte eine Trennung von Religion und Staat, eine gewisse Trennung. Und was jetzt passiert, ist, dass überall eine Art Religionsfaschismus entsteht, der als solcher aber nicht benannt wird. Und wenn ich mir vorstelle, zum Beispiel, dass die Nazis wieder so oft wiederkommen würden und würden Länder erobern, da würde die ganze Welt aufschreien, aber hier wird es nicht als Klerikal-Faschismus benannt und das müsste aber eigentlich passieren, finde ich, denn weil das Ganze eigentlich ein Affront auch gegen die westliche Kultur ist und das wird nicht klar benannt und das finde ich eigentlich, das müsste man unbedingt benennen.
Brooke, ist Assad das geringere Übel im Vergleich zu dem um sich greifenden Dschihadismus in der Region?
So Assad represents a unique challenge for the United States. I got very realpolitik before and said that stability underpins everything that we're trying to accomplish in the Middle East. In reality, you could say that supporting Assad fits into that. I don't think that that's the right way for us to go. Assad may not have been a tyrant in the same way that a lot of the other actors in the region have been. However, he represents a very negative force. And the civil war in Syria and the rise of the Islamic State are a result of a lack of the ability for people to decide where their future should be, from the lack of an open society. It's not the opposite way around. There's not terrorists because they're against their leader. There's terrorists because there wasn't a leader in the first place. Assad allowed a lot of negative influences, including Hezbollah and the influence of Iran, into the Levant. And I think this is one of the backlashes that you're seeing there right now. I think it's a really dangerous way for the West to start thinking about perhaps partnering with him. And I would generally recommend against going in that direction.
Emile?
Sure. The House of Assad has ruled Syria for 4 decades. It is responsible for the state of Syria today. Assad is as bad a tyrant as anyone else, and actually I would argue today that actually he's a much worse tyrant. Plenty of evidence of that. If you look at the death rates in Syria, Syria's population is 1/3 less than Iraq's population, but in 3.5 years, Syria, the number of casualties in Syria has already been higher than Iraq over 10, 12 years. The human rights abuses are massive. The fact that he portrays himself as a secular autocrat should not fool us. It's not because someone has an unveiled wife that somehow he's a moderate. Assad has used strategies of exclusion against other sects in Syria. Yes, he wasn't as ruthless at times, but when I just look at the numbers, Assad committed all the atrocities that ISIS has committed, except that he did so in greater numbers and from much earlier on. The difference here is that when Islamist radicals commit their atrocities, they want the world to know. Terror is a strategy for them. Assad, when he commits atrocities, he still needs deniability, ambiguity, because he wants to present himself as a head of state. So it's a few bad apples who did the atrocities. Oh, it didn't really happen, even though we know this. Up until today, the largest single massacre of civilians in Syria are the August 2013 chemical weapons attacks in Ghouta. It's not anything that ISIS did, not that I'm at all a defender of ISIS. I think it's a group that should be fought. These secular autocrats have failed, and their failure in governance is what led to the radicalization of segments of their society. They cannot be partners. They cannot be solutions in efforts to stabilize those countries. We should rid ourselves of this illusion. Otherwise, we're going to alienate more and more people in those very countries, because for them, the greater evil is Assad.
Ich habe hier vorne Ich habe hier vorne rechts eine Wortmeldung gesehen des Herrn. Ja, bitte sehr.
I would like to,
Stellen Sie sich kurz vor, bitte.
Heinz Treves, historian. I would like to look upon a Europe in a wider scale. Russia is a European nation, and we have the original Europe, which is split into many different interests, so that there is no immediate prospect of a real united Europe. And then we have Amerika, which has developed out of the history of Europe. I have had the experience that Americans don't like to look upon this historical point of view, but however, the facts are too clear so that they cannot be overthrown. So the question should be how these three Europes could find a unique basis, because these three Europes facing the same challenge towards the Muslim world. The question should not be who is guilty for this present situation with which all its controversies. Thank you.
Difficult question. Brooke, would you like to give it a try? Könnten Sie vielleicht die Frage noch mal ein bisschen umformulieren? Wir sind nicht ganz sicher, ob wir sie richtig verstanden haben.
In Deutsch denn, ja?
In welcher Sprache auch immer.
Ich habe von 3 Europas gesprochen. Russland ist eine europäische Nation. Und dann haben wir das ursprüngliche Europa, das in sehr vielen verschiedenen Interessen immer noch gespalten ist, sodass wir keine unmittelbare Aussicht auf ein wirklich einiges Europa haben. Und dann kommt Amerika, das aus der europäischen Geschichte hervorgegangen ist, auch wenn viele Amerikaner das nicht so gerne hören. Die Fakten sind einfach nicht zu leugnen. Und diese 3 Europas sollten eine einheitliche Basis finden, weil sie dieselbe Herausforderung, sich derselben Herausforderung gegenüber der muslimischen Welt stellen müssen. Und die Frage sollte nicht sein, wer ist schuldig an den gegenwärtigen Gegensätzen zwischen diesen 3 Europas, sondern die Frage muss sein, wie können wir eine einheitliche Basis finden.
Also gibt es sowas wie ein gemeinsames Interesse der USA, Russlands und Europas gegenüber dem Nahen Osten?
Mm-hmm. I believe that there are overlapping interests, and I hope I'm going to answer your question correctly. Emile touched on this before, that in the past, Europe reshaped itself. 70 years ago, Europe didn't look at all the way that it does right now. And the system that Europe uses to manage its nation states is one that was imposed on the Middle East, very much against their will at the time. And the Middle East is still coming to terms of what their societies should be shaped like, how governance should work, what the role of religion is in society. And right now we're seeing some of the aftermath of that. They're redefining who they are, what they stand for, what they believe, and what role they want to play both in the region and in the world. I think that the United States, Europe, and Russia all can find aligning interests. It's a matter of actually being able to sit down and determine where our interests align, what we'd like to see the world look like, how the best and most responsible way is to shape that without stepping on each other's toes, so to speak, and being able to live with each other and being able to find where we can be the most productive members of society. Does that start to touch on your question?
Somehow, okay. Mir wurde übrigens eingangs heute gesagt, dass wir heute fast eine ganze Schulklasse bei uns haben. Ich möchte unsere jungen Gäste auch ermutigen, sich zu trauen und ruhig auch mal eine Frage zu stellen. Aber ich sehe jetzt erstmal da hinten eine Hand. Genau.
My name is Stephanie, and my question is, isn't it also like America's duty to deal with the circumstances in the Middle East because of the wars they have caused there?
Could you reframe
the wars they caused there, the wars they made in the Middle East?
The cause. Okay. Okay, die Frage ist, was hat die Kriege in der Region sozusagen verursacht? Okay, let's do it once again.
Amerikas Pflicht ist, die zu unterstützen, weil die ja die Kriege dort geführt haben. Also
okay, hat Amerika eine besondere moralische Verantwortung?
Genau.
Okay. Brooke, that's another one for you, isn't it?
I absolutely believe the United States has a responsibility in the Middle East. We've been engaged there consistently. I do believe that we have made some mistakes in the past. One of those was taking all U.S. troops out of Iraq too early, too soon. It was a campaign promise that President Obama made, and then he followed through on, and it had some unfortunate consequences. It created a vacuum. That being said, I'm not sure that we wouldn't be in the same situation right now if the United States had remained fully engaged. I think the rise of the Islamic State was inevitable. I think it wouldn't have been as dramatic a rise, and the Iraqi military and the Iraqi society would have been more prepared. I can't say the same for Syria. I think that the Islamic State started in Syria to reconstitute because Iraq was a more difficult environment because of a lot of the after effects of U.S. training and equipping there. Like your original question is, do we have the responsibility? Yes, and I believe that the United States is following through on those responsibilities. The real issue at hand right now is whether or not we're doing enough or focusing on the right area.
Ich habe, wenn ich richtig geschaut habe, vorhin dort eine Wortmeldung gesehen, der Herr ganz am Fenster.
Björn Budde, Hausriss in Hamburg. Like many others, I was somewhat surprised by the success of the Islamic State in Iraq. And I was somewhat wondering, how come that the Iraqi military was so weak? Because I had expected them to be at least partially trained by the US, and what we saw, Islamic State more or less faced any real resistance from the Iraqi military, and I was questioning myself, did so many Iraqi soldiers turn sides, or were they afraid to fight the Islamic State? What made this huge success possible? Thank you.
How come, Emile?
Look, I mean, first, I think the answer is in your question. The success of the Islamic State is directly linked to the weakness of those against it, whether we like them or not. You know, the Maliki government before, the Iraqi security forces, the Assad government, etc. I mean, you know, those kind of groups thrive when there is societal dislocation, state fragmentation, etc. What happened in Iraq is essentially that the army was overly politicized in recent years. Since the Americans have left, Nouri al-Maliki, the then prime minister, has been able to reward and punish officers depending on loyalty. He promoted a number of well-known incompetent generals to head brigades and divisions. There was no sense of broad strategy. The Americans had given or sold the Iraqi government billions of dollars worth of equipment and trucks, etc., but logistics had broken down. There was not an esprit de corps in the Iraqi military. I mean, the officers were the first to flee, many of the bases, and Mosul in particular. I mean, just to give you a sense, in Mosul, we estimate the number of hardcore ISIS fighters who entered the town to just 1,500. Against them, there were probably 20,000. There was probably a whole division of soldiers, so probably around 30,000 Iraqi soldiers, and they just fled. It tells you something about the mindset, the psychology and the politics of those kind of conflicts, that those troops disbanded. They were not seen, the Iraqi military was not seen as a national army here to defend the state, greater values, civilians, etc. It was seen by the local population as a predator as a representative of an exclusionary, a repressive government in Baghdad. So, and this is something that the Americans can't necessarily do much about. It really depends on whomever is sitting in Baghdad and how inclusive that person is, etc. This is why the Americans, and very understandably so, were so keen on a change in prime minister, a change in government before committing to the fight against ISIS in Iraq. It's not necessarily about the men and the discipline and the weaponry, although this is extremely important. It's about a sense of purpose. The Kurds, the Peshmergas, have a sense of purpose. This is why they held the line. Others in Syria had a sense of purpose, including rebel groups from January to June 2014. This is why they drove ISIS from the northern part of Syria all the way into the east. But the sense of purpose needs to be maintained. It needs to be rewarded, and this is where the U.S. and other actors play a role.
And what I would add to that is, I agree with everything that was said. Prior to al-Maliki leaving as prime minister, it was determined that roughly half, 24 out of 50, of Iraq's military units weren't capable of fighting. That number had increased somewhat after he stepped down and they depoliticized the role of commanders. That being said, what the Iraqi military is struggling with right now is a crisis of confidence. And when a military starts to collapse, it happens very quickly and it's unrelated to capabilities. You saw this in South Vietnam. When the North Vietnamese came in, there was not overwhelming force. The South Vietnamese could have resisted and put up a fight, but they chose not to, because once you lose confidence, things start to unravel very quickly. People leave their units, their posts, their bases, and there's no one left to fight. And I think that's what we saw in Mosul. It wasn't an issue of whether or not Iraq was capable of fighting the Islamic State. They didn't have the will to do it.
Ich würde vorschlagen, dass wir noch eine letzte Fragerunde machen. Der Herr hier vorne, ich sammle einfach mal 2, 3 Fragen. Hier und die Dame auf der Seite. Ich glaube, mehr kriegen wir nicht mehr unter, sonst überziehen wir unser Zeitbudget.
Ja, vielen Dank. Mein Name ist Max Brauns. Wir haben heute Abend viel über die Verantwortung der Vereinigten Staaten gehört, noch mehr über deren Verfehlung in dem Gebiet, in der Arena, besonders mit Blick auf Syrien, the missed opportunity, was Emile nannte. Mich erstaunt, dass die Rolle Russlands hier überhaupt nicht zur Sprache gekommen ist, die für viele Verfehlungen meines Erachtens verantwortlich ist und über das man nie hört. Und meine Frage ist, wie sich so etwas entwickeln kann, dass alleinig die Vereinigten Staaten hier für vieles verantwortlich gemacht werden, obgleich Russland viele deren Bemühungen torpediert. Und das wird einfach so hingenommen, ohne das zu würdigen.
Vielen Dank.
Meine Frage ist, wie sich so etwas entwickeln kann.
Dankeschön. Bitte sehr.
Mein Name ist Dieter Weidel. Mir ist bewusst, dass es an Vogue ist, heute die USA zu kritisieren, aber ich denke, gegenüber Freunden muss berechtigte Kritik erlaubt sein, zumal die Amerikaner ja in bestimmten Situationen auch mit uns Deutschen nicht zimperlich umgegangen sind. Meine Frage, ist es nicht eine der Ursachen dieses Selbstverständnis, was Sie äußerten, dass die USA Bestandteil des Nahen Ostens ist und die Staatsdoktrin der USA, nur das zu machen, was ihnen nützt, dass das eine der wesentlichen Ursachen für die Problematik in dieser Region ist? Am Beispiel Irak kann man das deutlich sehen, als es opportun war, den Saddam Hussein aufzurüsten gegen den Irak. Dann hat man Waffen geliefert, hat also praktisch das Feuer gelegt. Und als Saddam Hussein nicht mehr so wollte wie die USA, dann hat man sich als Feuerwehrmann angeboten, um dieses Feuer wieder zu löschen. Danke.
Dankeschön. Und die letzte Frage hier links.
Mein Name ist Sabine Weber. Ich frage mal, ich möchte wissen über die Bedeutung der ISIS. Wo waren denn die amerikanischen Überwachungssysteme, die zwar in der ganzen Zeit, als die ISIS bei uns langsam Fuß gefasst hat und wir wussten, was da auf uns zukommen könnte oder was in dem Raum passiert mit ISIS, die haben in der Zeit unsere Frau Merkel überwacht, aber dass man sagen konnte, dass die genau wussten, was dort vorgeht, wie die ISIS-Leute langsam Macht gewinnen, das hat Herr Präsident Obama ja selbst gesagt, dass er das wohl unterschätzt hat.
Brooke, ich habe das Gefühl, die beiden letzten Fragen waren irgendwie an dich adressiert. Einmal die Frage, wo waren denn eigentlich die amerikanischen Dienste bei der Aufklärung von oder in Sachen Aufklärung ISIS? Und ist die Politik der Amerikaner in der Region nicht eigentlich sehr inkonsistent? Ist das Teil des Problems?
Regarding monitoring, I'm going to call it intelligence, of what was happening in the Middle East, there were definitely some gaps that became very apparent very quickly. I don't think that the United States had properly predicted how quickly the Islamic State would rise and how powerful they'd be. One of those things was not understanding how quickly the Iraqi military would collapse in certain parts of the country. There's definitely a hole in intelligence when it comes to Syria. We don't have the same resources on the ground there as I think people would imagine that we do or they would like for us to have. But that's also a matter of collaboration. Intelligence sharing is done between two governments, and right now there's not anyone to share with on the ground in Syria. It's very much dependent on what we're capable of doing, and that's limited at this time, and that's somewhat made our decision-making perhaps less capable than we would want it to be. That being said, there's also a policy issue here of whether or not we were prepared to act in Syria, or we wanted to act in Syria. The way that the US policy infrastructure works is very complex, and it involves a lot of different inputs from different players. And one of the criticisms from inside the United States that the Obama administration has gotten recently is that they've been insular and they haven't been taking the input of the Department of State, the Department of Defense, from the intel agencies, the Central Intelligence Agency, and all of the criticism has been coming, all of the decision-making has been coming from the White House. And when you see one of these policy issues, the red line issue that the United States had in Syria, the president said that there was a red line, that if Assad used chemical weapons, that the United States was going to be forced to intervene. Well, then he used chemical weapons, and the United States was caught and did nothing. I think that represented actually more of a failure on the policy side of things, because if it had followed through the regular policy process, going through all the different agencies, creating consensus, building contingency plans, the United States would have known how to react and reacted immediately. I think instead what they did was use grand rhetoric to say, we have all of these ideals in the region, but then we didn't follow up with anything. I'm not sure that's as much of an issue of intel on the ground as much as confusion back in Washington on what we should have or could have been doing at the time.
Und die Frage des Herrn, wie inkonsistent ist eigentlich amerikanische Politik und besteht darin nicht auch ein großes Problem? Die Amerikaner lassen sich immer nur treiben von ihren eigenen Interessen. Ist das die Schwierigkeit bei der amerikanischen Außenpolitik?
I think that's a difficulty all countries have when it comes to creating foreign policy. The old, international relations intro course teaches you that politics ends at the water, and beyond that, it's about your country's interests and doing what is going to be. In fact, Bismarck. We were walking around Hamburg today, and I saw the big statue of Bismarck in the park. I mean, he was the first person who advocated that type of realpolitik, to follow your own interests. As far as consistency is concerned, I think there has been a lot of inconsistency when it comes to rhetoric. I actually see the most of those inconsistencies with how we've been dealing with Iran recently, that we've been sort of trying to find a soft opening to create a warmer relation with them. And that's sort of backing away from our hard line on them not becoming a nuclear country. And I think where the US could benefit from is restating very clearly what their interests are and following through on them and saying that, we're going to fight Iran when they, provide lethal support here, when they are supporting Hezbollah, if they're, shoring up Assad, and when it comes to negotiating, when it comes to the P5+1 negotiations.
Emile, du hast heute das letzte Wort. Wie steht es eigentlich um die Rolle Russlands im Nahen und Mittleren Osten?
You won't hear me defend Russia in the Middle East, not for a second. I think Russia has been a very problematic player in the Middle East, and especially when it comes to Assad. It has provided unconditional assistance to Assad. Actually, it has increased the supply and the quality of the weaponry to Assad after the chemical weapons attacks of last year. It has been uncompromising on the diplomatic issue. It has actually put a lot of obstacles in front of UN resolution dealing with the humanitarian dimension of the crisis. We tend to forget one thing, how massive the humanitarian aspect of the Syria war is. It is unbelievable. I mean, I just went to a few camps. I know some of, and the Russians behave with that from a very cold, distant perspective. They've used their veto in New York a few times against those kinds of resolutions, have blocked presidential statements, etc. But look, Russia, an Arab official told me once, I don't like what Russia does. I don't like what Putin does, sorry. But I like how he does it. And that's a very telling statement, is that the swagger, the confidence, even though there's a lot of contradictions and problems behind it, the swagger, the confidence with which Russia states its interest and dismisses contradictions. So there's one line on Ukraine and there's a totally different line on Syria, but it doesn't matter. We all, ask the Americans, why are you not consistent, etc., but we don't do the same thing with Russia. And when I say we, you Europeans and we Arabs as well, we have a blind spot in a way. We like that Russia is closer to the Arab position on Palestine, but we tend to forget that Russia tends to be on the wrong side on another issue. So all of us have issues of inconsistency, or let's call it hypocrisy at the same time. So no, Russia has definitely been an exacerbating factor. The problem is that Russia is a P5 member. It is one of the negotiating parties with the P5+1 with Iran. Russia can easily raise obstacles on this or that issue. It can link Iran to Syria. It can actually sabotage other approaches or make it harder. Sometimes it's a helpful player. On Iran, at times, it has been a helpful player. It has helped pass UN Security Council resolutions in the past few years. So it's very difficult to get it right, because the cost of obstruction for Russia is an acceptable one. There's not much public wrath. It's not that Russians themselves will protest against the hypocrisy of their foreign policy. All they care about is how Putin looks and how much he flexes his muscles. And from our perspective, it's much, as I said at the very beginning, it's much easier to criticize the US. And you're entirely right in this point. And this goes back to the point that the gentleman was making. Inconsistency is the privilege of the global superpower. Only the United States has to deal with security crises across the globe. Only the United States is asked, how much are you doing on Ebola at the same time as they're intervening against the Kurds? The range of missions, the range of responsibilities of the US is massive. And you know what? Overall, the US plays a very positive role in the world. At the same time, this invites more scrutiny, and it's an open system. So we can criticize it here in Hamburg, but we can fly all the way to Washington and say it in front of the president himself. So this is why we indulge in a lot more criticism of the US compared to others. Now, I would love to also indulge in criticism of Germany's foreign policy, because I have a lot of things to say about it as well. But it's not as relevant. and it's not as relevant as the US and the region. So, you know, it drops off the radar. But the inconsistencies in Germany's foreign policy are also massive. And we don't discuss that much. It's the nature, it comes with the power you hold.
Und schon haben wir eine... Und schon haben wir eine neue Diskussion vom Zaun gebrochen, die wir nicht heute Abend führen wollen, aber die wir sicherlich an anderer Stelle auch hier führen werden im Körber-Forum. Wir sind, meine Damen und Herren, am Ende einer, wie ich finde, sehr, sehr spannenden Diskussion angekommen. Ich möchte unseren beiden Diskutanten, Brooke und Emile, hier auf dem Panel ganz herzlich danken. Und Ihnen, meine Damen und Herren, natürlich auch fürs aktive Zuhören und auch für Ihre interessanten Fragen und Kommentare. Ich nehme zwei Sachen mit nach Hause aus dieser Diskussion. Die Amerikaner, die USA, sind weiterhin die unverzichtbare Nation im Nahen und Mittleren Osten und werden das, glaube ich, auf absehbare Zeit auch bleiben. Wir Europäer müssen aber auch ein bisschen vor unserer eigenen Haustüre kehren, glaube ich. Wir müssen unsere Verantwortung, die wir dieser Region, die ja ganz nah an uns dran ist, gerecht werden und dürfen, glaube ich, nicht immer nur mit dem Finger Richtung Washington zeigen. In diesem Sinne bedanke ich mich ganz herzlich bei Ihnen und lade Sie ganz herzlich wie immer bei uns hier im Körber-Forum, noch auf ein Gläschen Wein bei uns zu bleiben, gleich beim anschließenden Empfang. Vielen Dank.